first question to George, I think the key to this is making sure that conservatives understand that this is an opportunity to fix a broken system and get it right. And so when we see things in the Senate bill, when we see things that the House group of 8 are working on in a bipartisan fashion, working on for years, by the way, when we see them and we don't like them, we need to say, here is how we will fix that, as opposed to here is how we will continue to not address this problem.
I've got to move on to the other big bipartisan thing we saw this week, which was gun control. The president did something extraordinary over the weekend. He turned over the weekly address to Francine Wheeler. Her 6-year-old son, Ben, was killed at Newtown. Take a listen.
In the 4 months since we lost our loved ones, thousands of other Americans have died at the end of a gun. Please help us do something before our tragedy becomes your tragedy.
So the NRA actually lost a vote this week. I mean, you know, the vote, the procedural vote to move forward on gun control. But does the NRA still hold the cards here?
Well, I think gun rights are, and people, gun owners out in the country are what most of these senators are concerned about. And that is the problem. You talked about a bipartisan compromise. You had one Republican senator. He's been joined by a couple of more Toomey coming out.
But Pat Toomey's not exactly a squish. I mean, this isn't like
but okay, but here's the real issue on this. What you really want, and you know, what happened in Newtown is worthy of all the emotion you're seeing this week, okay? But there's also an obligation to do something that is effective in actually dealing with this. And I think one of the problems that this amendment is going to have is that what you want is a system whereby law-abiding gun owners, who make up the majority of people who own guns, have the ability to go, and you help them to be able to check and use a background system if they need to see and reassure themselves that they are actually selling their gun to somebody who's not a bad person. That's not what this does. This expands the current system. Big government reach. You're also going to be required to keep records. That law enforcement is going to be able to access this.
Well, this
has been the huge no-no, though, of gun owners, and it's why, because they decided to go as far as they did on this amendment, that you're not likely to get both a huge number of Republicans or even a lot of Democrats, as you mentioned, Chuck Schumer.
It should be, as Kim says, effective. It also should be congruent with the Bill of Rights, of which the Second Amendment is a part. Now, it is part of the tragedy of this tragedy is that it occurred at Sandy Hook immediately as the president began after the election. He has spent an inordinate amount of time and energy in what will be the most precious moments of his second term, probably, the early months here, on this. We're not going to get a ban on what are meretriciously called assault weapons, and are simply semi-automatic weapons, 40% of all weapons sold in this country. We are not going to get universal background checks. We're not going to get a ban on magazines. Does anyone at this table believe that when the Senate and the House do whatever they're going to do, that it will make a particle of difference toward preventing...
Okay, Ruth.
How would it
there you go.
I do.
Okay.
I do. I do not think we're going to get assault weapon ban. I do not think we're going to get magazine limits. I think we're at a rather extraordinary moment where it's easier for Republican and Democratic politicians to support same-sex marriage than it is for them to support the same law that was passed in 1994. And so to the extent that there is the possibility, and I think there is the possibility of progress, it's going to be limited progress on expanding the background check system that is already in place. Would that have prevented Newtown? No. Could that prevent future Newtowns? Yes. Will it stop everybody who's determined to buy a gun, who isn't entitled to buy a gun, from getting one? No. Will it stop some people? Yes. The existing background check system, where if you fail your background check, you could just go buy one at a gun show, has gotten stopped 2 million transactions. Some of those people went and got other guns. That would be harder under this, but some of them didn't go and get other guns. And
what's wrong with background checks?
Well, first of all, the issue here is, are you going to require law-abiding citizens to face greater burdens to no effect? That, in my opinion, is the issue here. What you've got to deal with here is the fact that this administration...
It's a quick check, though, isn't it? I mean, and their bill's 2 days. At maximum.
But it's an individual citizen.
It takes 7 minutes.
And there's no distinction between a sale online or a sale offline. There's no sense of that. Okay. You can't mail a gun through the mail to somebody after they buy it from you online. You still have to go and get it from them because it's illegal to mail the gun. Draw the line between commercial transactions and individuals selling guns, and then enforce the law and work to get more data
very
into
quickly.
the
And I got
I'll tell you who's applauding and who's clapping any lack of success on gun control. Gangbangers and drug dealers across this country. They're happy and delighted because they are murdering and killing young people each and every day.
But they don't follow the law now.
A background check?
Yes, I think it is the beginning of a conversation we need to have in America to control guns because it's having a devastating effect. I need to do everything I can to ensure that another young woman like Hadia doesn't get murdered in the
I'm
city
all
of
for the
Chicago.
First Amendment conversation, but not at the expense of the Second Amendment.
But it isn't at the expense. It's at the expense of our youth and our youth in this country.
Well, very quickly, Ruth, you...
Don't get the issue that George raised, where George and I are both big believers in the Constitution. We interpret it slightly differently. What is the infringement on Second Amendment rights to ask people to have a background check and to keep some record of that? The government isn't going to go rifling willy-nilly through people's files. It's going to give them an ability, if there is a crime committed with the gun that you've sold, to maybe go back and trace it to you. Everybody should welcome that.
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
So we have determined that the 76,000 people who were found to have lied on the background check in 2010, 4,700 of them were referred by the ATF for further investigation and prosecution. 62 of them were prosecuted. Every Republican on the House Judiciary Committee signed a letter to the President and the Attorney General asking why that is and why there isn't greater enforcement. Enforcement's down 40% overall in his administration. The answer we got about the background checks was those are paper crimes. Well, they're not paper crimes. They're felonies because they're perjury. And if you set the example of lying when you do a background check and prosecuting them, you'll have fewer people trying that. But why would the solution to that be in creating more paper crimes?
So we should enforce the law and also make sure that we improve the law. So I'm with you on, but just so that we get clear, George Bush's presidency had the same dismal record on enforcement of the background check, and as this presidency has during the last 4 years. Let's improve it together so we can improve the quality of life. Okay, I think 9 out of 10 people in America have said we can do reasonable background checks without infringing on people's right to bear arms.
We're just about out of time. I do, before we leave, want to talk about this Beyonce, Jay-Z, because there's a serious issue about whether or not we should have a Cuba trade embargo, travel ban. Jay-Z, in his response on this, said, "I'm in Cuba. I love Cubans. The communist talk is so confusing. When it's from China, the very mic that I'm using." I mean, he has a point, George. This has been an odd policy. We've had trade with countries that are far worse on human rights than Cuba.
The Cuban embargo may have made a lot of sense during the Cold War. The Cold War is over, and it is hard to think of a policy more firmly refuted by events than the policy of the embargo, which is supposed to weaken one of the, it turns out, most durable dictators in the world.
All right, that may be something Ruth Marcus also agrees with you on. Thank you very much. Thank you to all of our roundtable. Up next, Jackie Robinson's legacy, our conversation with the greatest relief pitcher of all time, Mariano Rivera.
This week.